Today, I just want to have a quick casual conversation with you about your headings on your website, because if you're new to website design or edits, you're probably doing this wrong and it's doing you a disservice in a lot of ways. So this is a really easy thing to fix, and I want to teach you the best practice so that you can actually fix this really quickly. So it will impact you the least amount and help you with your SEO, because this does actually help you regarding getting found on the Google landscape. So before I dive into that, if we haven't met before, my name is Caitlin. I run Launch the Damn Thing. I'm a Squarespace web designer and educator, but I've been a graphic designer by trade since 2006. So I know a thing or two or five. And I'm happy to share that with you here for free on the YouTubes. So let's dive in. I'm going to show you some examples and walk you through it. Hopefully we'll keep this really short today. Okay, so I want to go through, actually, this is going to be a little bit weird, probably a little bit new, a little bit different than what I normally do, frankly, because I'm lazy and I didn't want to come up with new slides. I know, right? Imagine. I'm a busy gal. So what I'm going to do is actually show you snippets of an older blog post that I'm going to actually republish the same day that I'm doing this video. So it'll be fresh in the feed for new people that haven't been around. But this is actually a post that I published probably in 2022. And it still lives on, and I think more people should know that it exists. So let's take a look at some of the examples here, because what are we talking about actually? First of all, I want to make sure that you know the difference between headings and a header on your website. I know that those are almost exactly the same. So what we're talking about here is actually headings as in text. So we're not talking about the top level navigation on your website. That is your header. Your header usually contains the logo, your main navigational links. So usually that's a link to your about page, your services, or your shop page, maybe a blog if you have something like that, portfolios, a button to some sort of call to action to work with you, to buy from you, to sign up for a membership, to do something that's really important to the overall business. But that's a header. What I'm talking about today are actually the titles in your website pages and when to use which one specifically. Because what I find on DIY websites very often is that you kind of arbitrarily set the styles for these, and then you arbitrarily use them based on when you want this style versus that style, or this size versus that size. And this is not specific to Squarespace. This is actually specific to any website builder. So if you're on Showit, if you're on Webflow, if you're on WordPress, if you're on Squarespace, Wix, Weebly, I can't think of any more. It all applies. The difference here is going to be how many options you have for styling your header. So on Squarespace in 7.0, you actually only have 3 options. You can set the font differently between those 3 options. In version 7.1, which is the newer version of Squarespace, you have 4 options. They're all the same font, but they can be different sizes. You can, of course, custom code this to be different. And on my current websites for my custom projects, I do often do this. I've done that on my own website too. On other platforms like Showit, for example, there are a lot of heading options. You can do like 6 or so, if I remember correctly. And you can style each of those totally differently between the fonts, the sizes, the colors, all of the things. So this varies drastically. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why a lot of people just assume that this is like general styling for the different types of headings that you might want to use in your design, but actually it's not a design first approach, or it shouldn't be. So the number one thing that I can tell you in this tutorial or guidance video is to make sure that you understand that these should be used in chronological order on the page, because what they're actually doing is telling Google, this is the list of information that we're going to be talking about on this page, and every time you see one of these, that's going to be a section where I am talking about that thing. So essentially it's building an outline in the code when you use these, and that's how Google will quickly crawl the page to understand what the page content is about before it crawls all of the content in detail. This is also a quick way for people to like scroll through quickly and get a sense of what the page is about. So it's more than just how Google crawls. It's also for accessibility purposes, for SEO purposes, maybe even for screen reader and accessibility purposes for people who are visually impaired and use screen readers to look through the site and tab through for the important stuff. So you really, really want to use these in an intentional and strategic way. So let's take a look at some examples here. We have an example in a Google Doc. I know we're getting pretty basic here. So in the Google Doc, if you type out some document and you use what's called the paragraph styles options, you have access to this in any word processor. It's always the same. It is sort of in the area of the font option picker thing. And most people don't use it. But if you have used it, you're going to notice that it's going to give you heading 1, heading 2, heading 3, and then like maybe a subtitle or a subheader or paragraph or normal or regular or some list of options like that. Notice if you start picking these and assigning them to the sections in your document, for example, your title, you give that the title, and then in the next subtitle in your eyes, whatever's the next most important piece of information, you give that a heading 1 or heading 2. If you do that on down the document, what you'll find in Google Docs specifically is maybe if you have it turned on, you'll be able to see sort of an outline of the document in the left-hand sidebar, and it's creating that based on what you have assigned in your headings. This is what Google is looking at in the code, so to speak. So this is a great example of seeing how this comes to fruition, how it actually acts, but in a simplistic form in a Google Doc. Another example is any of the blog posts. Most of them. I have a lot, so I've been slowly updating the older posts, but in a lot of the newer ones in the past 2 or 3 years, I've been including a table of contents at the top. And that is a plugin I got from Athletic Marketing. It actually uses the headings in my blog post to create those jump links. So at the top of my blog post, I have something called table of contents, and that has a click, show, or hide. If you open it up and toggle it open, you can see the list of headings that are available. And if you click one, it'll jump down to it in the blog. So that's an easy way for people to jump down to a section that's most interesting for them rather than reading what tends to be a very long blog post. Sorry, not sorry. So that's another example of how headings are actually acting in the code. You can see this in kind of an outline bulleted format in Athletic Marketing's table of contents plugin that I'm using on my blog. So again, we're talking about making sure that these headings, they make sense. They are worded in a way that sort of summarizes the content that they are labeling, and they are used in successive or chronological order. Another thing that you might not know is that the heading 1 is the title, and it is the most important thing you can put on that page, and you should only ever use it one time per page. Once. That's because you can't have a services page about working with you on a custom website project and also have a heading 1 that says, oh, by the way, I also sell software templates. Those two things don't make sense. You would not put them together. So don't use a title that's the most important thing. It's kind of like when you write a book, the title of the book is probably the biggest text. It's on the cover. It's the most prominent thing. On a website, this is a much better example. On a website, your heading 1 is the book title. In your heading 2, it's the second most important thing on the page, and so it needs to come successively. So you don't want to put a heading 2, like layout wise, above a heading 1. You don't want to put a heading 3 above a heading 1. You don't want to put a heading 4 above a heading 1. You see where I'm going with this? Not only is the heading 1 the most important thing you can put on the page, but it needs to be at the top with nothing else above it in theory. There are some loosey-goosey, like if you know the rules, you can break them kind of situations, but primarily, in most use cases, it's going to be a best case scenario for you to put literally heading 1 as the first line of text on the whole damn page so that you make damn sure Google knows this is the most important thing. It's my heading 1. This is the book title, so to speak, and everything else on this page is going to match up with this statement. Underneath that, you want to apply kind of the same rule to everything else. So if you're in a section, heading 2 is going to be the second most important thing on the page. It should summarize whatever comes after that. And if you need a heading 3 or 4, you want to apply that after the heading 2 and so on down the list. So heading 3 is the same thing. Heading 3 should be the third most important thing. If you need a heading 4, it should come after a heading 3. And if you need a heading 4, it's the last one in the Squarespace world in 7.1, so you don't have any more options after that. It's all paragraph text. The question you're probably going to be asking me is like, well, I want to use a heading 2 in this section, and then a heading 3 or 4 in this section, and then underneath that, another heading 2. You can do that. I don't like to do that. I try to use heading 2 lightly and heading 3 and 4 more frequently. So when you style this in your site styles, you want to make sure that these follow the sizes in order of most important to least important. But if you start out really big, like for example, 4 to 6 REM for your heading 1 in Squarespace, then you leave room for your heading 2 to still look like a heading 1, even though it's not, because it can be close to the size that you gave your heading 1, and so on down the list. So that if they were stacked next to each other, you could say like, oh yeah, that's heading 1 because it's the biggest, heading 2 is slightly smaller, heading 3 is slightly smaller, heading 4 is slightly smaller, but they can still all be quite large. So if you need them for importance, for like visual hierarchy, in addition to the code hierarchy that tells Google which things are most important, make the sizes follow that hierarchy that you want. But don't pick them arbitrarily. So one of the ways that this affects your SEO potentially is if you have a lot of kind of weird headings or placement of your headings on your website, and someone clicks through to your website from a Google search and they land there and they don't see any kind of like they're not guided through reading through the content on the page because it just seems sort of arbitrarily placed or arbitrarily styled. They can't tell which ones are headings, which ones are paragraphs. They don't know what order to read things maybe. It's very likely that they're going to bounce. That ultimately tells Google they clicked through, they looked at it for 2 seconds and they left, which tells Google this page does not contain the information that matches the key phrase that I pulled up for it. So in other words, if your page is ranking for Squarespace web design and the person clicks through to your website and they bounce in 2 seconds or less, then Google's going to, with the pattern of this happening over and over and over again, it's going to eventually say, okay, this page doesn't actually need to rank for Squarespace web design because people who click on it from that search don't stay on that page. So this is one of the many reasons why you do definitely want to pay attention to where you use your headings on the page. And I'm not alone in this. Henry Purchase of SEOSpace, he says the same thing. And when you use his tool, it'll actually tell you you're using your heading 1 too many times. You're using one heading, but it needs to be a little bit longer. You need to stay between this character count and this character count for your heading 1. So it's a very specific kind of middle ground that you're aiming for. It needs to be clickbaity to some degree, like create some interest, but also descriptive of what's on the page content, but you also got to stay within a certain character count. It's not that easy. But if you use a tool like SEOSpace, it can help you understand where you're kind of getting a little bit off track, and it can rein you back in and give you an interactive and engaging checklist to go by so that you don't forget these tiny little tedious steps. Or you can work with somebody like me and I will do the manual labor for you. So really quickly, let's go over some key indicators or some key style tips for setting in site styles. So first of all, size matters. Insert joke here. Size matters, and you can use size to your advantage. So for example, if you have a large heading, that will take visual precedence over something that is even brightly colored next to it, because you're going to see the bigger thing before you see the smaller, brighter color in most cases. So you can use size as an indicator of importance, along with the fact that font style that you're using is in heading 1, which is the most important. So your viewers won't know when you're using a heading 1, because they don't know on the back side of the website what you've selected, right? They're not going to know what the font is or any of that stuff, but they are going to be able to see it large. So when I say I make my heading 1s on average, and of course this does depend on the font size and width and all of that stuff, because every font takes up different amounts of space. So that's what I'm saying. Size matters, and you can use that to draw attention beyond just the fact that you have maybe a bold font choice or a bold color choice. You also want to pay attention to what fonts you're using, because they do need to be legible. This is another mistake that I see a lot of newer designers make when they pick a font that's not that legible, or they use something like script in places where they really shouldn't. If you're using on a website specifically, you don't want to be using script in that many places, especially if it's a harder to read script. If it's something more like handwriting where it's almost printed and you can see the individual letters are not tied together, it's not super thin, the line work in it is not super thin, then yeah, fine, go for it. But for a lot of script fonts, my own included, both of the ones that I've ever used in my branding, well, all of the ones that I've ever used in my branding, I've used a lot over the years. They tend to be used sparingly, because I recognize that even though they are beautiful or trendy, whatever, they don't always have the best readability. So you don't want to make your heading on the page or heading 1 in a script font in most cases, because you want the most amount of people to be able to read it very clearly. Google's going to know what it says because it knows what keyboard letters were typed to create the display. They understand all of that. But the people on the other side of the screen, not so much. You also want to make sure that when you use a script font, you never, ever, 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 under any circumstances, add extra space between the letters, because it was not set up to do that. And you never, ever, 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 ever want to use it in all caps, because again, it was not meant to do that. When did you ever write a cursive like script thing yourself in all capital letters? Like, nobody does that. It's hard to read. It's hard to follow. Those are two things you just definitely want to avoid. Last, to help you with hierarchy, you can also use color, using that to your advantage. So if you have two things that are of similar-ish size, or if you have a secondary piece of information and you want to draw attention to that without taking away from the large size of a heading next to it, you can use color to direct someone's attention in a certain order. So if you want someone to read the heading first, the heading 1 first, make it huge, make it really big. And then for your heading 2, you can make it smaller than the heading 1, but in a pop of color. Or if you're going to do a heading 1 with a paragraph and then a button, and you want them to see the text and then the button, make the button obvious in a way that they would see that as an option to click on after they finish reading through the text. So depending on size, color, style, you can actually force someone to look at your shit in a certain order the way that you want them to, because that's just the way that our attention spans work. We see little pops here and there, and we tend to follow that in kind of an order of hierarchy, right? And that's the whole point of this video. So I hope that this was helpful for you, kind of clarify that and helps you put it into practice on your own website. If you're not sure, you can take a deep dive into the blog post that accompanies this video, as I've updated it and reposted it, and so it'll be at the top of my blog now. If you want more tips like this, then definitely check out my All Things Squarespace playlist, where I'm going to keep on updating and giving you extra tutorials as Squarespace continues to update the platform, and more design tips like this along the way. See you next time. Bye.